In this video, I want to take a shot at giving some sense of international trade theory, how the theory that we talk about all the time actually creates some of the winners and losers in the politics of international trade. And I want to do so by starting with a bit of supply and demand, a bit of the, graphic representation, statics that you can use to manipulate and also understand a bit of how those winners and losers are created. And all with the big caveat that this is something that I normally do freehand on a chalkboard. And so the challenges with doing this on a video, I apologize for any of the hiccups along the way. But hopefully try to convey a few of these things to you, a little bit of the technical aspects of how we think about international trade, the creation of winners and losers, and therefore the politics of international trade as well. So just to kind of reiterate a little bit, sort of the big takeaways, if any of this gets really confusing for some of you. But one of the big takeaways from my course, this entire course, is that when we talk about international trade and the benefits, the broadly distributed benefits of international trade, we want to be cautious in talking about those benefits because the same trade that predicts the broadly based benefits of international trade also at this very same time predicts that there will be losers, that there will be distributional consequences from international trade. The winners from international trade are broadly distributed throughout the economy. Consumers, longer production runs for manufacturing as they service foreign markets. But the losers, so-called losers, are highly concentrated, highly politically potent. And so this set of lecture slides is really designed to pick some of that apart and try to help you understand how those winners and losers are created. So let's begin with just a little discussion of the determinants of supply and demand. For you economists out there, that this will be old hat. Anybody that's taken sort of Econ 101 won't find this particularly sophisticated, but just as a reminder for all of us, especially in politics, that there are things that change the supply, change the demand for certain kinds of products. Among them are some of the really obvious things like incomes. As your income goes up, you're probably going to demand different kinds of products, more expensive products. You're going to switch from eating, instant noodles and craft dinner to maybe you have very, highfalutin tastes, and your income will allow you to eat steak every night, something like that. Also, tastes. Tastes themselves change. We're not static societies. Our tastes and our preferences for certain kinds of goods and products evolve over time. Fashion is a good example of one of these things where demand for certain kinds of, shoes. We move from wearing big platform shoes to wearing flats or, the length of hemlines and things like this. These have a big influence on demand curve that we'll talk about here in a second. Other kinds of sources of demand, shifting of a demand curve or fluctuations in demand for certain kinds of products. Prices. The prices of substitutes and complements. If you go to the grocery store, for example, and you want ketchup versus salsa, and you find them you're indifferent to whether or not you choose one over the other, maybe the price will have an impact on whether or not you purchase one or the other. Things that go together, bacon and eggs maybe is a good example. If the price of bacon suddenly goes through the roof, maybe you're not going to buy quite as many eggs. And so these kinds of things also, the prices for substitutes and complements have a big influence on the demand for certain products. So expectations as well. If you expect, I see a typo there, if you expect prices to shift, 6 months from now, if you expect the price of your craft dinner to go up, maybe you're going to buy the big mega pack at Costco now while it's cheap. And so, your expectations about the future, about future price fluctuations may affect your propensity to purchase now, thereby affecting demand. If you expect that, for example, crops are going to get wiped out and the price of bread is going to go through the roof 6 months out, you might do the same thing. Airlines do this all the time. They're constantly hedging because of their expectations around the cost of fuel, for example. 6 months out, a year out, they may see the price of fuel going through the roof, and so they may purchase fuel right now. Similarly, they may see it falling, and so they'll purchase futures contracts for jet fuel 6 or 8 months out that are much cheaper than they are right now. And so expectations have a big influence on the immediate demand for certain kinds of products. And then population. As your population grows, then so too does the demand for a whole range of products. Larger population, more consumption, and more demand for all kinds of products right across the board. And so those are some of the basic determinants of demand that we can begin thinking about. So what about supply? If we want to think about the supply curve, and we'll get to showing you these curves and how they function here in just a second, but the determinants of supply. We've already gone through the determinants of demand, but what about the determinants of supply? Well, technological changes are major determinants of supply. As technological innovation changes the costs of production, or maybe makes certain kinds of products obsolete. Suddenly the supply, if you don't want VHS tapes anymore because we've moved to compact discs and now to flash drives and streaming and so on of our audiovisual consumption, those things change the supply of those products. They become much more plentiful, much cheaper as we move away from some of them, and we want to adopt the latest technological change to our multimedia consumption. So technology has a big impact on supply. What about factor prices? Well, as the input prices for all the products that we purchase fluctuate over time, we may find that the supply of those products, if the prices of those products, of inputs to a product that we buy spikes because of scarcity, for example, then we're going to have a shortage of supply. We are not going to be able to get as many of those products, and so you're going to see reductions in supply because of those changes to factor prices. The number of suppliers. If you have a large number of suppliers, if you have a monopoly, one supplier, they're going to charge monopoly rents for things, and so the supply might be restricted. But if you have a whole bunch of players in the marketplace, the number of suppliers providing those products to us, you're going to see the supply curve shift out because you're just going to have more suppliers providing more of those products to us. Expectations. Similarly with demand, I mean, if you see expectations, down the road, you see climate change affecting, for example, the annual harvest of certain kinds of commodities. We're going to have shortages of certain kinds of commodities. You're going to see supply shortages as well of those kinds of products. And not unrelated, of course, is weather. Often, Mother Nature really takes its toll on the ability of suppliers to provide certain kinds of products, just because the fluctuations, shortages, short-term spikes for example, maybe there's some sort of a blight on strawberries or some other kind of fruit, or maybe the wine crop is wiped out because of fire in California, for example, and therefore the weather has a big impact on basic supply, the movement of the supply curve. Okay, so how do we take the determinants of supply and demand and translate them into something like this, a little diagram? Now this is where in the course I put this up on the screen or on the blackboard, and I get out the dry erase markers, and I explain, for example, about how a supply curve is determined, how the demand curve is determined. I say that they actually are not straight and they're actually curved in some way, and why that they're like that. You economists in the room will look on in horror and be not be thrilled with the simplicity with which I'm going to treat this. But what I really want to do is use this very simple supply and demand diagrams to begin a discussion that we will then build upon to show the distributional consequences of the imposition, for example, of a tariff. But for now, focus on the supply and demand curve, the upwards sloping supply curve, S1 in this diagram, and the downward sloping demand curve, D1 in this diagram. And again, thinking to our determinants of supply and demand, imagine, just to see how this functions, imagine that there is suddenly an increase in demand. The downward sloping demand curve moves from D1 up to D2. It moves out along the supply curve S1. Okay? So if you can follow that, you move from the original price, which is on the left axis, P1 and Q1, there's a spike in demand, moves along the supply curve, S1. The demand curve moves out, and what you see is a short-term increase in prices and perhaps an increase in the quantity supplied because of that spike in demand. So instead of price P1, you have a spike in prices to P2. And you also have, because of that demand, to whatever extent there is extra supply in the system, you do have suppliers offering up a little bit more in terms of quantity. So moving the actual quantity supplied out from Q1 to Q2. Now, if we go to the very next diagram, and again, just for representation purposes, this is not going to make an economist thrilled the way that I'm depicting this, but just for representation purposes, again, thinking about the determinants of supply and demand. Imagine in this case, there is a sudden increase in supply. So the supply curve, S1, that's upward sloping, expands out. There's a sudden supply, there's a sudden bumper crop of strawberries on the marketplace, and the supply curve suddenly shifts along the demand curve D1. That doesn't move in this diagram. It's just a supply shift, an increase in supply, a sudden increase in supply. Well, it moves from S1 to S2. What happens to the price? Lots of stuff in the market, right? Intuitively, we know a little bit about how this works because we go and we say, wow, prices dropped. Must be lots of supply around. Sure enough, there is a reduced or an increased supply, and that reduces prices. So you have a price drop from originally P1 down to P3, but you also have this sudden increase of supply depicted in the expansion from the original quantity in this diagram, Q1, all the way out to Q3. And so you have a new equilibrium point along where the supply curve S2 meets the original demand curve D1, and at price level P3 and quantity level Q3. And so you can see, as we think about sort of shocks, if you want to call them that, to that list of determinants of supply and demand, you can see how these demand curves, demand and supply curves, may move as a result of that, affecting the supply and demand, or at least the price and quantity that are actually offered up. Before we start thinking about adding a tariff and show the distributional consequences of adding a tariff to the diagram we were just looking at, I want to go back a little bit. And I want to say a couple of things, or just remind us of some of the arguments of early free trade thought that you read in Douglas Irwin's book, Against the Tide. Remember that people like David Hume came along and said, you know, mercantilism has some inherent limits to it. If all you have is a positive export balance and you put up barriers to trade, imports from abroad, barriers to those inputs, eventually all you lead to is inflation. And it's a kind of self-defeating kind of thing. As gold flows into your country, as foreigners pay for all kinds of your stuff, eventually your stuff becomes too expensive for those foreigners to actually purchase. And so again, Hume sort of saw this kind of limit to a purely mercantilist orientation where you protect your market and assume or adopt a purely export-oriented kind of trading policy. Well, Adam Smith came along And remember, Adam Smith was kind of unhappy about the monopoly power that mercantilism was conferring on certain companies in the UK. He thought monopoly power was inherently detrimental to labor because that monopoly power allowed those firms chosen by the crown, they would be the only ones that were allowed to produce and export, gave them too much power over labor, over the terms of production. And so Smith's basic critique in favor of more liberalized trade was because of that monopoly, the corrosiveness of monopoly power. But his argument was really simple. He thought countries should diversify, should specialize in the product that they, and trade the product that they produced best, most efficiently in terms of units of labor. So whoever had the cheapest labor costs ought to, in a given product, ought to produce more of that product and export it in exchange for products in which they had very high labor costs. And so again, it's a labor theory of value, but based purely on labor costs. Then if we go down and we get to Ricardo, and Ricardo is a little more subtle. David Ricardo's argument around comparative advantage is a little more difficult, and there's a separate video on this. But the key insight here is opportunity costs. It really isn't just about labor costs. It's about how much of one product you have to give up in order to produce just a single unit of another product. And if you have to give up fewer of product X in order to produce a little more of Y, then you actually have a huge comparative advantage in product Y because you have to give up fewer, you have to divert fewer resources away from production of X into Y. Therefore, you should specialize in Y, export in Y, export more of Y, and trade for more of product X. And so it's a more subtle argument, but the question then becomes for us in this class going forward is, does that Ricardian argument around comparative advantage and the idea of opportunity costs, does it still hold in a modern trading regime? So Ricardo may have thought he had a pretty good argument, but the challenge here for us is when we think about Ricardo, he also made a lot of assumptions, as did Adam Smith, but a lot of assumptions built into Ricardo's argument around comparative advantage. Among them, perfect competition. He assumed perfect competition domestically and internationally. He said there are many buyers, there are lots of sellers, and there's no monopoly power. He also assumed that there's perfect information. The flow of information between buyers and sellers and all of the inputs that go into production and exporting and import, all of that information flowed seamlessly, and that there was equal access to information on all the products that were available to us. And so no market restrictions, a perfectly fluid kind of market. Well, we know that that isn't really the reality. There are lots of hiccups, exceptions. Perfect information, it doesn't exist. There's relative degrees of that, but perfect information is not a condition that typically holds. And so already we're seeing a bit of a few caveats to Ricardian comparative advantage. What about fixed national resource endowments? Well, yes and no. But those of you that know, that have followed the oil and gas industry in the last 10 or 15 years know that we were talking about peak oil just a few years ago. And then all of a sudden, technological change comes along and makes some of those tight oil plays, as they call them, accessible. Fracking, for example, revolutionized, certainly in the United States, revolutionized America's power to exploit formerly inaccessible oil and gas reserves. And so we're always discovering, new kinds of resource endowments, deploying technology in different ways to stretch out the useful life of those endowments. And products come along that require different kinds of resources. And so the idea that we have a fixed national resource endowment just doesn't hold up to scrutiny over time. Then, of course, is the related issue, and I've kind of killed my own thunder on this, of technology. Ricardo kind of assumed a static technology, technological base, that no technological change. And we know that that just doesn't happen. And so we're constantly seeing a kind of evolution in resource endowments, technological change that affects supply and demand for all kinds of products, whether it's domestically or internationally. And so when we think about Ricardo, this assumption, does it hold? Is it something that we should be, maybe it's a big hole, a big enough hole in Ricardo's argument around comparative advantage that we ought to dismiss the whole thing? Yeah. Well, there are other caveats to Ricardian comparative advantage. Transport costs or tariffs. He argued or assumed that that neither of them were in existence. We know that transportation costs a lot of money. Transportation costs have fallen dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years, but it's still, it isn't nothing. And so transportation costs are a big deal. He also assumed only two countries trading. And clearly that isn't the case either, okay? He also assumed that labor was really the only input. So like Adam Smith, he assumed that labor was really the big issue, really the main determinant of efficiency when it came to the production of different goods. He also assumed that labor was mobile between industries domestically, but not between countries. Now we know that, yes, labor is mobile between countries, but it's not purely mobile. There are barriers to moving from one jurisdiction to the next, including a kind of knowledge base. One kind of labor deployed in the production of one thing doesn't necessarily translate or move easily to the production of a different kind of product. And so there are these kinds of barriers to labor mobility. There are also rules about whether or not you can ply your trade from one jurisdiction to the other. But certainly, labor is less mobile between countries. And so that condition still holds in many cases. There are lots of people that can move from, say, Canada to Singapore to take a job, of course, but not that many. And so, in a sense, labor mobility as a barrier or a reasonable assumption, a lack of labor mobility between countries still holds. No capital flows between countries. This is also another assumption that Ricardo made, and we know that that just isn't the case. Capital flows all over the place between countries, within countries, but especially between countries, capital flows are incredibly abundant, and so this assumption in Ricardian logic is also doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. And then he assumed also, finally, that there were flexible wages and prices. Full employment, and that wages and prices would adjust naturally, and that there were no real hiccups or barriers to those adjustments in wages and prices. Wages and prices, we know, though, are relatively sticky at times, and sometimes prices rise much more quickly than your wages. And so there are all kinds of little barriers to that flexibility in wages and prices. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, if we're making all these assumptions, does Ricardian logic around international trade still hold up? So as you perhaps might imagine, economists have been hard at work for many decades trying to sort of assess whether or not Ricardian logic around international trade still holds up, given all of these assumptions that he has made in order to come up with this powerful argument around the utility of opportunity costs in shaping patterns of international trade. Well, two economists, Heckscher and Ohlin, I think it's Eli Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin. You economists in the room might actually have heard of these two guys. They continued their work trying to figure out whether or not Ricardian logic held up. And they made a number of their own modifications to Ricardian theory, and you can see them here, numbers 1 through 5. Heckscher-Ohlin theory, and I'll read it here in the next slide, really is about the factor intensity, the use of one country's relatively abundant and therefore inexpensive factor of production. If you have a lot of labor or a lot of raw materials, then you can develop, under Ricardian logic, a comparative advantage in the exploitation of that relatively scarce and therefore, that relatively abundant and therefore inexpensive or cheap factor of production. And so if you read the actual Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, I'll just read it out here. A nation will have a comparative advantage in, again, Heckscher-Ohlin is trying to resuscitate or find a way to explain or understand Ricardian logic in spite of some of the caveats that we've already talked about. So a nation will have a comparative advantage in and be able to export the commodity whose production involves the intensive use of the nation's relatively abundant and therefore cheap factor of production, and will have a comparative disadvantage in and import the commodity which uses intensively in production the relatively scarce and therefore expensive factor of production. So if you have a factor of production that's really scarce and therefore very expensive, your country should probably move away from the exploitation of that and move into and export the products that use that intensively, and actually move into specialization and expansion of the production that uses that relatively abundant and therefore inexpensive factor of production, and therefore then trade the products that are made with that fairly cheap and relatively abundant factor of production. Well, if Heckscher-Ohlin was correct, then you would see countries like the United States with a large pool of capital using that capital to expand the production of goods that take advantage of or require that abundant and therefore cheap capital, using that to produce capital-intensive goods, and then exporting those goods to the rest of the world, importing goods that were, for example, labor-intensive from countries like India or China, where there's an abundance of labor, and they had specialized in the utility or exploitation of labor to produce things far more efficiently with labor than the United States could. And so you would see this pattern. Well, the challenge is that Vasily Leontiev comes along and kind of looking into Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, and he discovers that the patterns are not as they laid out. And in fact, in many cases, you find exactly the opposite kinds of patterns, where you have the United States importing capital-intensive goods and exporting labor-intensive goods, right? The opposite of what you would expect under Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. And you see countries like China that are exporting capital-intensive goods and importing labor-intensive goods. And so it's a very strange sort of paradox. And so that's why it's called the Leontiev paradox. And so his basic conclusion was that, hey, look, if Heckscher-Ohlin theorem makes some sense, but at the same time, maybe there's something else going on. And that's the point of all of these slides that I'm showing you right now, is that we're trying to figure out what are the determinants of international trade. We're trying to sort of get down to how much of what David Ricardo had to say about comparative advantage and opportunity costs still actually holds. The last little puzzle that I want to throw at you in terms of thinking about Ricardian trade is maybe something that makes intuitive sense, might make intuitive sense to a lot of you given your knowledge and study of the politics of international trade. But it's this concept of factor price equalization. Again, another kind of building upon the basic Ricardian idea of what are the patterns of international trade. How is international trade shaped? What determines the kind of patterns of trade we see between countries? Well, factor price equalization. This is basically an argument where two countries open up trade between each other, and then when that trade opens up, the factors of production that go into each country's production and then trade with each other, those factors, the prices, the value of those factors of production begin to equalize. And so this makes some intuitive sense probably to some of you, because when you think about, for example, the United States and China becoming intensive trading partners, trading all kinds of goods and services with each other, you're seeing there's some argument that the relatively low wages of many Chinese manufacturing establishments are putting downward pressure or limiting the upward rise of wage rates in the United States. And so you're seeing that factor price, the wage rates as a factor price, converge or kind of come together in some sense as the countries become more intensively linked via trade. And so there's a lot of evidence around this, a lot of research going on around this, but the idea that trade is a kind of vehicle for factor prices to converge, whether it be labor, capital, or the prices of various input commodities, intermediate inputs, and so on. And so factor price equalization is something that has also drawn a lot of attention from economists, trying to look at whether or not factor price equalization is an outcome or a byproduct of the intensification of trade. So, what are the determinants of trade? We've gone through and said, hey, Ricardo made a lot of assumptions that don't necessarily hold up. We've gone through a couple of the efforts on the part of economists to kind of resuscitate or explain some of the caveats and argue about whether or not trade is still determined more or less on the basis of comparative advantage. So what can we kind of come to in terms of conclusions here? Well, the basic determinants of international trade remain these. And you can see them here on the screen depicted in these slides. One, relative factor endowments. The factor endowments, natural resources of one kind or another, do have an impact on international trade. Canada as a major exporter of natural resources, that is a huge component of Canada's export profile, the extraction and export of natural resources, whether it's minerals or oil and gas or forestry. Similarly, China is now one of the dominant global powers in the extraction of rare earths, the kinds of minerals that go into components in your cell phone, for example. That's not a huge piece of their trade, but it is a growing piece of their trade. And because China happens to have a lot of that in the ground in China, that is one determinant of their trade. Taste differences, basic preferences. Different countries have different tastes, and therefore that is also a major determinant of patterns of international trade. Certain countries consume different kinds of products, whether it's a taste for certain kinds of fish or beef, or maybe high technology products, very expensive, capital intensive, high technology products. Those are also determinants of trade. And as countries get richer and you move up the income chain, their patterns of trade just inherently change. There's something called the Linder hypothesis, which is worth considering in all of this. And that is that international trade patterns, if you sort of break them down and have a look at them, disaggregate those countries' trading patterns, what's remarkable is how similar the countries' markets are to which Canada trades. Canada trades with other rich countries. The United States tends to trade with other rich countries. They tend to produce some of the same kinds of goods, and they send them to each other's markets. And so again, a kind of strange sort of pattern to sort of wrestle with in all of this. Part of that is driven by income levels. Canada, to the extent that it produces a lot of high-tech manufactured goods, needs other countries with similar incomes in order to consume those goods. So Canada needs to send some of its goods to the United States or to Europe because those are jurisdictions that have similar incomes and are consuming the same kinds of goods that Canadians are producing. So the Linder hypothesis, there's some things there. Technology differences. Well, product cycles tend to mature. Sometimes the country, many times the country that invents something then perfects it and really expands its production of it. But then once it becomes a mature technology, it's easily replicable. And so other countries say, hey, they're doing it, we can do it too. And so technology differences and product cycles in terms of a technology will come and grow in its infancy and then mature, and then other countries will copy that technology or maybe even improve on it in some cases. And so that is also a pattern of that affects trade, because as a country adopts that technology, maybe it's a mature technology, a lot of that, the originating country's production will move offshore. And so you see these production cycles having an impact on patterns of international trade as well, where the originating country no longer actually uses that technology in its production. It imports those things from abroad because they're easily replicable and done more cheaply abroad. Transport costs. Transport costs are still an important part of international trade patterns. Takes a lot of energy and takes a long time sometimes to get things across the oceans or through air cargo. But standardized shipping containers, there's some really interesting books, believe it or not, about shipping containers and how those shipping containers that all stack on top of each other, or they're 2 or 3 high on trains, and then they go into these huge container ships. That is dramatically reduced because they're standardized and you can throw anything into one of those boxes. It's dramatically reduced the cost of shipping over the last 30 or 40 years. But transportation costs are still an important determinant of international trade. Economies of scale. There's a whole bunch of them to consider here on economies of scale. But you know, when you, going back to technologies, as you perfect an infant technology and it becomes mature, you produce more things better, more efficiently. And so you realize a whole bunch of economies of scale because you're expanding that production. And so your input costs, your final product costs, all unit costs, all of those things become less expensive with time. And so you realize all of these major economies of scale. And so as you ramp up production, you perfect what you're producing and really get better at it. The efficiency with which you're doing it grows, and you realize all kinds of economies of scale. And so your unit costs drop and your profitability goes up as a firm, and therefore you're going to export those things that as you're producing more of them less expensively. You know, all of your basic R&D costs are recouped. Your financing becomes cheaper. You know, you get all of these kind of learning by doing economies of scale that really do, in the short run, especially in the growth and maturity of a new technology, can really drive patterns of international trade and give countries a serious competitive advantage, or companies rather, a competitive advantage, and then in principle, a country a comparative advantage in the expansion of the production of a particular good and export of that particular good. Now, let's see if we can apply some of what we've been talking about here to our diagrams. And so bear with me, because this is one of those areas where I usually would do this on a whiteboard or something, and so this is new terrain for me as well. But let's start with thinking about no trade, autarky. Autarky is no trade. You are an economy that trades with nobody. You're North Korea. And so everything that you consume, you have to produce at home. And in this diagram, that is depicted at the cross of supply and demand, where P2 and Q3 meet and the supply and demand curve actually cross. In this situation, a country like Canada has to produce absolutely everything that it consumes. And so it's a very limited kind of economy. You can imagine if Canada was not a trading nation, could not trade some of its excess production abroad, it's a relatively small country, 36 million people. It would have an entirely different industrial structure. Even though Canada is rich in natural resources, it's small in population. And so if it doesn't trade some of that excess production, fewer people are going to be working on those assembly lines in Canada. Fewer people are going to be employed in agriculture. There will be fewer products to choose from because there's only a market of 36 million people. And so autarky is really a very restrictive kind of environment. And there's hardly any countries that are like that. I mean, even the North Koreans trade sort of illegally, illicitly, breaking sanctions and so on. But autarky means no trade whatsoever. Well, let's suppose that a government comes along and says, hey, We don't like this autarky business. We want to put more of our people to work. We want to import more goods from abroad to have more, consumables for our consumers. And we want to do so at a less expensive price. Because the autarky price, no trade price of everything we consume is more expensive because we produce less of it. There are fewer of those products to choose from. And so it's inherently more restrictive in terms of the number of products we get to use, but also the prices of those products tend to be higher. So an enlightened government, you might say, could come along and say, hey, we're going to move away from autarky and we're going to throw the doors open to international trade. And we are just going to try and trade at world prices. Whoever the cheapest, the least expensive, the most competitive global traders are, we're going to source more of our products from there. And so on this diagram, you see that the government opens trade, opens the domestic economy to trade, and now begins to trade at global prices. So instead of a higher price, autarky price of P2, that world price, no tariffs, no restrictions whatsoever, drops considerably to P1. That is the world price. That is the least expensive price that the world has to offer in terms of goods and services. Well, look at what happens for consumers, for example. Under autarky, domestic consumers were purchasing things at a high price, P2, and at a quantity of 0, the apex there, 0 to Q3 down at the bottom. Well, now under a world price, look what happens. You can see that consumers in our domestic economy are now consuming more stuff, 0 to Q4, right? As the world price fell, we consumed all kinds of stuff, lots of cheap stuff at Walmart now to be had at our disposal. And so this is great for consumers, right? Well, one of the challenges here, these are the winners, by the way, the consumers are the winners. And to the extent that we ramp up our production and send our stuff, the stuff that we're good at producing abroad, we're winners too, right? We're longer assembly lines, more products we're sending abroad, where foreigners are paying for our stuff, all good for us. Well, what about domestic producers that are producing things that we're now importing? As consumers, we're now getting stuff that is on our shelves in a quantity 0 to Q4, where before it was 0 to Q3. Well, one of the problems is that you can also imagine in this diagram or depict in this diagram some of our production challenges. When we were under autarky, producing at Q3 at price P2, we had an employment base that produced stuff out from 0 to Q3 along that lower axis, okay? But look what happens when we move to open trade. Our production levels now shift back. We lose production. Instead of producing things 0 to Q3, we are now, as a domestic economy, only producing things 0 to Q1. Because we're importing now all of the stuff between Q1 and Q4. We're consuming way out to Q4, but our imports have now displaced some of our domestic production. So we lose. Our losers are, in a sense, depicted in that space between Q1 and Q3 because we reduce some of our, or lose some of our domestic production because we are now importing a lot of those goods from abroad. This diagram repeats what we've just been through in terms of what happens when you move away from autarky to trading at world prices. And you get all these benefits to consumers. It doesn't depict here the expanded production lines and so on. But the real challenge that is depicted here and explained a little more fully on the left side of the diagram is what happens to the released workers. Remember, Ricardo talked about the move to specialization and trade, expansion of trade, based on comparative advantage, opportunity costs and comparative advantage. He talked about released workers, the concentrated losers, if you will, that are displaced because a country is now importing from abroad and displacing some of that production that took place under autarky. Well, the issue here for those of you that are fans of Ricardo and Ricardian trade is, what do you do with the workers that are released who used to occupy that space depicted in this diagram along the bottom axis, Q1 to Q3? Under autarky, they were all employed, producing things for domestic consumption, 0 to Q3. Now they're only employed 0 to Q1, and so we've lost a bunch of workers. Well, Ricardo's argument was that these were released workers, and that they would find their way into the area of our new domestic economy that is producing things for export to global markets. Well, how quickly does that happen? What happens to those released workers? How quickly can they find work in that area of our comparative advantage now that we are importing things that we have a disadvantage in from other countries, right? So what happens to them? How quickly can they find work in these areas? And so when we talk about winners and losers, you can already see in this use of this diagram, and you can argue or talk about who the winners are, how they're created, but also, and also how they are distributed broadly throughout the economy, right? Consumers, those that have longer shifts at factories producing things that we are exporting abroad. But at the same time, you can also depict here or see here the creation of those losers, those highly concentrated losers, because they're often in individual sectors, and they often have some difficulty transitioning to a new sector that for employment. And so you can see the creation in the theory itself, the creation of winners and losers. Now we want to try and build upon the last diagram, which was the move from autarky to free trade. We want to say, well, what happens if a government comes along and says, you know, we're not exactly thrilled with complete free trade. Maybe there's a way we can capture some benefits or some, especially unemployment, by adding a tariff. And so in this diagram, what you see is the imposition of a tariff. And you can immediately see that the distributional consequences of that are quite interesting. On the one hand, a tariff obviously increases the prices to domestic consumers for all imports. And so instead of consuming at price level, the world price, price level P1, you're now consuming at a price level that is world price plus the tariff. So it's a higher price, P2. But look at what happens to our consumption, our imports, and even our production. So under free trade, the world price at price level P1, the country was consuming, the domestic economy was consuming at 0 Q4 along the bottom axis there. With the tariff, now suddenly all these consumer goods are very expensive. And so suddenly we as a group of consumers, domestic consumers paying the higher tariff, are going to be disincentivized from actually purchasing foreign goods. And so we're likely only going to consume 0 Q3 at that higher price P2. Well, similarly, when we look at employment, we can also see an impact here. Under the world price, if we had totally free trade, again, P1, world price, we were only producing, the domestic economy, 0 to Q1 because we were sourcing all of those imports in the area Q1 to Q4. Well, now we are actually consuming less, we're importing less, but we're also producing more for the domestic economy. So under free trade, we are producing 0 to Q1. Under the world price plus the tariff, it incentivizes some additional domestic production rather. And so we're actually now producing at 0 Q2. And now, instead of under free trade importing this large area, Q1 to Q4, we've now reduced, because of the tariff, we've now significantly reduced our importation of goods, and it is now reduced to Q2, Q3, because we have this additional domestic employment that is satisfying some of our demand. Our economist friends would go a bit further, and they would actually try and figure out how to quantify some of this. And so when you see the imposition of a tariff on the domestic economy, trying to put tariffs on imports, Economists want to know what the size or the impact of the distributional consequences are. And so these lettered areas, these little sort of, in the triangles and the kind of these spaces that you see in the middle of this diagram represent that. If you could quantify these spaces, you would have a pretty good sense of what the actual costs of that tariff really were. So let's go through them very quickly. So let's start on the left side, this area J, this sort of trapezoid, looking thing, parallelogram, I don't know what it is, but it's this area bounded by J and signified by the letter J. This is a redistribution effect. This is a loss of consumer surplus, so a loss from consumers who, under free trade, got all these goods for cheap from abroad. This is a loss of consumer surplus transferred to domestic producers, because now we're producing more stuff domestically. So all of that cheap stuff, that surplus, the benefits that consumers were getting from cheap stuff with free trade, that some of that has been transferred now to producers, domestic producers, as they now try to fill that gap. What about area M? Well, area M is what they call a deadweight production loss. This is because the tariff has incentivized inefficient production. We do not produce in our domestic economy the most efficient widgets or the most efficient products that we used to source from other countries under free trade. We may be able to produce them, but we do not produce them the most efficiently. And so that is a deadweight inefficiency loss in a sense, this area M, a deadweight production loss. Area R is a deadweight consumption loss. You and I, as domestic consumers under the tariff, we're no longer going to be producing or consuming quite as much stuff. And so that area R is a loss. What about N? And this is one of the more important bits to focus on. N is the tariff revenue itself. So all of these losses in area J, M, and R are at least to some small degree offset by the revenue effect, the tariff revenue. This is tariff revenue that goes into the Treasury. It's collected at the ports of entry when things come into the country, and it goes into the public treasury to be spent on government programs, healthcare, education, so on and so forth. The question is, and from this diagram, it clearly doesn't seem so, is does the revenue effect, the area N, the tariff revenue, offset all of these additional inefficiencies that are brought about from the tariff? Now, the other question on this is that whether or not this is the most efficient, and clearly is not, do you get a political benefit from incentivizing a little more production? What kind of trade-offs as a government are you thinking about if you can, with a tariff, incentivize a bit more domestic production? Is it worth the inefficiency or the loss of consumer surplus? And so as a government, you might shrug your shoulders and say, look, we as a society, we're going to eat a little bit on the high cost of imports, the loss of consumer surplus because of this deadweight consumption loss in area R, but we're picking up a little tariff revenue in area N. And on top of that, we'll live with some of the inefficiency in area M that is incentivized by all this extra domestic production. We'll live with that if we can have a bit more employment. All right, now this diagram gets a little bit more hideous because now we're going to introduce a free trade price. Imagine that the government says, the tariff has been a little too expensive, and they decide to engage in free trade. Not free trade with the rest of the world, but free trade with an individual country. So think the NAFTA or Canada-US free trade, just one other country, okay? And the important thing here is that this free trade partner may not be the world's most efficient producer in terms of Ricardian comparative advantage. They may be more efficient than you in some areas, right? But not the world's most efficient, okay? So that's an important distinction or caveat to think about when we look at this diagram. And so what you see here is simply an additional layer that's being added to the previous diagram, and that is free trade with a single partner. Okay, so a free trade area. Again, not necessarily the most efficient producer in the world, but a producer that is more efficient than you. And so you're engaging in a preferences arrangement, a free trade arrangement with a trading partner. And so you see here in this diagram that suddenly, with your free trade partner, you are now reducing that tariff. You're reducing tariffs vis-a-vis your free trade partner, okay, but not the rest of the world. You're reducing your tariffs, and so it's the dotted line, the FTA price, okay? So as a domestic resident, you went from paying the full tariff price, world price plus tariff at price point or price level P2, to now paying a slightly lower price at P3 because that's the FTA price. You're getting lower prices. There are reduced tariffs on goods from your free trade partner as they enter the country. And so what you see here is a few gains, right? So as a consumer, when you had the world price plus tariff, our country was only consuming 0 to Q3. Under the free trade price, right, under free trade with our trading partners, we gain a little bit of consumption in the form of 0 to Q6, right? So in the sense that area between Q3 and Q6, we gain that as domestic consumers because of this free trade price, okay? That we're getting things from our free trade partner, and we're getting the benefits of these lower prices, okay? And so we get a bit of extra consumption relative to the full tariff, okay? But then when you look at production, we lose a little bit. There's a little bit of there's a few released workers because we have liberalized our trade with a single free trade partner. And so in this diagram, when you see the world price plus tariff, we were producing quite a bit, 0 all the way out to Q2 there on the bottom axis. Now, because we've liberalized with a single trading partner, we've reduced that production. We release a few workers because now we're only producing 0 to Q5, again at price level P3. Okay, so we lose some production. There's some released workers that have to be absorbed. Moreover, under world price plus tariff, right, a big heavy tariff, we are only importing the area Q2 to Q3, right? But now that we have a free trade area, we are now importing a slightly larger space, Q5 to Q6. So we increase our tariffs, we expand our consumer surplus, but we do lose a bit because we release a few workers, right? We've engaged in liberalization with our one free trade partner. But notice, of course, that this is not as free and liberalizing as just throwing the doors open to the world's lowest price at price level P1, but it is an improvement. Now, with the same diagram, I want to point out what these lettered areas are once again. And with each of them, because we have moved away from that heavy tariff, okay, to a freer, a more liberalized trade with our one trading partner in this preferences arrangement, a lot of these areas of inefficiency or revenue are now going to improve a little bit from a consumer's perspective, an efficiency perspective. Okay, and so if we take area A, all right, remember area J in the last diagram was this redistribution effect. The tariff redistributed revenue or benefits from consumers to producers. Okay, well, under free trade, area A is a kind of return of some of those benefits back from producers to consumers. Okay, so a redistribution effect that is the benefit of having liberalized and brought more efficiency to your economy through free trade. All right. Now, area C, if we go down the list here on the side, remember area N in the last diagram was all of the tariff revenue. Okay. Well, area C now is a loss of tariff revenue because we have engaged in free trade, reduced our tariffs vis-a-vis our trading partner. And so we lose a little bit of tariff revenue by reducing that to area C, all right? Well, Area B, because we have reduced our production, we've released some workers by liberalizing with our free trade partner. We are reducing that Area B, that triangle Area B. We are gaining, in a sense, more efficiency because we're no longer incentivizing inefficient production. However, the result of that, of course, is a loss of some of that production, a loss of workers, released workers. That we need to have, find a way to get them working in a different sector. Area D, consumers are going to benefit. We're now consuming a greater range of products, many of which are being sourced from our free trade partner. And so Area D is a gain, a pickup of consumer surplus relative to the world price plus the tariff. And so consumers are big beneficiaries of this liberalization with a single country. Now, the really important one here is the thing in Area E. Area E is what they call the trade diversion effect. And this is an inefficiency that comes from free trade with a single partner or just a small group of regional partners, say under the NAFTA. What you're doing, and the reason this is an inefficiency, is because what you're doing under free trade with a single trading partner, or two like under the NAFTA, is you are incentivizing the importation, tariff-free importation of products, of goods, from countries who may not be the world's most efficient producers. Okay? You're incentivizing production in your free trade partner countries and importing from those countries, and they may not be the most efficient at producing these things. And so you get an inefficiency that comes around because of that that economists refer to as the trade diversion effect. So in this slide, this sort of disaggregates or talks at greater length about that Area E, the trade diversion effect. And the inefficiency that trade liberalization with partners engaging in preferences arrangements with countries who are not necessarily the most efficient, the world's most efficient producers. One of the components of that inefficiency is something called rules of origin, which we've talked about a little bit in the list of commercial policies that we've gone through. Rules of origin are essentially complicated bits of paperwork that producers, companies, have to fill out in order to qualify for tariff-free trade with your trading partners in your free trade area. Because you don't want goods transshipped through your member countries from non-member countries, and somehow, skirting the rules or getting around the tariff-free treatment and somehow sneaking their goods in into Canada through Mexico because they have a slightly lower tariff. In order to qualify for tariff-free treatment for something produced in Canada, to have it shipped to Mexico, you have to produce a lot of these rules of origin. They're complicated, basically assertions that everything that the good was produced with components all made in Canada, manufactured with Canadian labor, so that it can qualify for tariff-free treatment when it crosses the border into the United States and Mexico. And this is partly connected to this idea about the stages of integration, the neoclassical stages of integration, and how shallow a free trade area is. Remember, a free trade area only liberalizes tariffs among the members of the free trade area. Each of those members retains the right to have a completely separate tariff schedule vis-a-vis non-members. And so the worry is that you'll have transshipment, people trying to game the system and sneak goods in from other parts of the world through the member country who has the lowest tariffs. And so you need these complicated rules of origin to try and deal with that. And those by themselves create a high degree of inefficiency. For a really good graphic explanation of how that works and why they're so complicated, the last slide here I've linked is a short video from the Peterson Institute of International Economics. And they do a really good job graphically describing how complicated some of these rules of origin are and help explain why that trade diversion effect, when we think about trade liberalization in a preferences area, it can actually be quite substantial. And so I invite you to look at that. It's kind of it's very, very well done, probably better done than I just tried to explain it. And so I invite you to have a look at that.